Welcome to Behind the Badge. This podcast aims to improve the health and well-being of frontline workers. Each episode features candid conversations with former and current frontline community members and subject matter experts. Join us as we explore the unique nature of serving in high-risk roles, sharing inspiring stories of resilience, strategies, and resources. We are not qualified health professionals, nor are we aligned with any organization. The opinions expressed in the podcast are solely our own. Additionally, the content may evoke strong emotional responses for some. Listener discretion is advised.
I don't wanna promise that we have an answer, and I don't wanna promise that we know the way. I just wanna bury the guilt of the nature like a tidal
G'day everyone, welcome back. In this episode, Jason and I are sitting down with a guest by the name of Dr. Nikki Jamieson. Dr. Jamison is a suicidologist, researcher, author and social worker. She holds both a Master's and PhD in suicide in Australia, with her thesis exploring moral injury and suicide. Her influence extends across government and policy, having contributed to suicide prevention strategies for DVA, Queensland Health, the Mental Health Commission and the Department of Defence. Her voice has shaped key frameworks like Queensland's Suicide Prevention Plan and the mental health and wellbeing strategies for serving and former military personnel. Beyond her professional credentials, Nikki brings a powerful lived experience. After the heartbreaking loss of her son to suicide while he was serving in the army, she became a fierce advocate for change, using her experience as a driving force to undertake a study and ultimately push for better systems of support and health outcomes for our defence and veteran community. This is a conversation about evidence, empathy, and the urgent need for systems to do better, for those who serve and for those who love them. Now, we just wanted to put out a very quick content warning. This episode we talk about a lot of heavy topics and subjects, suicide ideation attempts, and things like that. So listener discretion is advised, and if this does affect you in any way, we encourage you to seek the appropriate supports. Welcome to the show, Dr. Nikki Jamieson.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on board.
Thanks for having it at your wonderful house. It's a pity it's not a vodcast rather than a podcast.
No, absolutely beautiful setting in the backyard here. Thank you very much again for having us here and for coming on and spending your time with us. What we might do, Nikki, is start with your background. Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Bradford, which is in West Yorkshire in England, so kind of in the centre of England, if you like. Lived there for just over 30 years before migrating over here in 2005/6. So I've been here 20 years almost, so long time. Yep. Maybe I'm a local now. Or is that up to 60 years or something, I think. So a bit more to go.
Why did you migrate over here?
The sunshine. Yeah, as you probably know, England is not very sunny a lot of the time. But yeah, the sunshine was part of it, but a lot of it was family. So I was actually supposed to be over here when I was 12 years old when I lost my parents. My aunt and uncle over here actually tried to adopt me back when I was 12 years old, and the Aussie government of the day wouldn't allow that adoption to happen. So I was a late bloomer and came over later.
So what were you doing in England before you came over here?
So a little bit of everything, really. So I was a social worker. I did a little bit of hairdressing. I did some TV work. And then I worked with what we called our minority ethnic groups in supporting them through university education. I also did a couple of years of nursing training before switching over to social work. So I've kind of always been a bit of a jack of all trades, master.
Well, even the hairdressing, don't they say you're almost a social worker as a
Absolutely.
as a
And that's
hairdresser?
why I got into social work,
Really?
because of the hairdressing work that I did, because I was finding people were naturally talking to me and actually gravitating towards me in that way. And I thought, I'm sure I can earn more than a couple of pound an hour by having these conversations. So then I moved into social work. yeah.
Nice.
Awesome. And so you moved over here, like I said, when you were 30. Did you already have Daniel at that point?
Yeah, so I would have been 32, so that gives away my age. Yes, I was 50 last year. So he was about 12 when we moved over here. So he was just starting, he had to do his last year of primary school here and then go into the high school here. And yeah, he enjoyed the move, made friends really easily because of his English accent. He was a hit with the young ladies.
I was going to say the girls dug in.
Yeah, so yeah, he had a lot of good friends here.
Nice.
Did he want to move over? Like you said, he settled down here and enjoyed himself. But prior to that, leaving home at a young age, was he sort of receptive to coming over here?
Yeah, I mean, we've always travelled a lot as a family. When he was little, we'd always be travelling to Europe or wherever. And he knew the family from Australia, so was really keen, to move here and start a new adventure. And yeah, England was rapidly going downhill and is probably still continuing to do so from what I'm reading. So we decided to make the move and to try and give him as many opportunities as we could give him, which Australia was, the land of opportunity for him at the time.
Fantastic. And did you continue when you migrated over here? Did you continue in a social work role?
No, I went back into hairdressing. I decided I wanted something different but same. So did hairdressing for a while. Ended up having to redo my social work qualifications because of the recognition of qualifications from one country to another. So ended up redoing my hairdressing and my social work. So did hairdressing again, finished off my social work, and then went back into social work for quite a few years, nearly about 13, nearly 14 years, but more in that more of that strategic level social work, so kind of that macro level as we call it, so looking at organisational change to support people who may have been vulnerable, and also working with children and families in Queensland Health, particularly children who had developmental or behavioural concerns, and then working in early years mental health for a long time. So yeah.
Well. And so along those lines, I guess mainly for my benefit, what does a social worker do?
A social worker basically supports a person in their environment. So if you think about, us as people, there are lots of systems around us, be it our family system, our own individual system, our work system, our financial system. What a social worker does is has a look at all of those systems around a person that may be impacting on that person's day-to-day functioning and their mental health and well-being, and tries to actually help and make those connections to support that person in their system, in their environment.
Yeah, right. So you'd have to be across, like I said, there's a lot of systems there. So you'd have to have a lot of those connections into different different organisations and stuff like that, I imagine.
Yeah, linkages and connections and that case management type work is fundamental in social work. Compared to psychology, it often works with the person and what's impacting that person. Social work works with everything around that person and that person.
Yeah, wow.
And that includes working with psychologists, occupational therapists, nurses, education, whatever.
Yeah. Over here, and did you say Daniel was 12 when you moved over?
Yeah.
At what point for him did the military come into the frame?
Well, he'd actually been interested since a child. You know, he used to play with his little army green plastic soldiers, and we'd always play like shoot 'em up games, and he had his own little kind of army uniform. So he was always interested in joining defence or the army, particularly in some capacity. So when he came over here and had his daughter, he really wanted to create a stable future for her, and you know, something for her to be proud of as well. So he started the process and obviously got in, and he joined in 2012.
So upon joining, obviously goes through training, all that sort of stuff, down to Kapuka for basic training for 12
Correct.
weeks. At this point, with your social work background, you know, were you picking up anything from Daniel at all, anything that might flag with his health or anything like that going into defence?
Not really. Obviously, there's a massive change. It's a bit of a culture shock for people going through Kapuka. So those changes definitely identified. He became much more robotic. The person that went into Kapuka wasn't the person that came out of Kapuka. But I expected there to be changes because obviously there has to be intensive training to create the war fighters that we need to defend our country and the people within it. So I didn't expect the changes that were visible. He was very... robotic is the only word that comes immediately to mind, but he was very, you know, stoic and just very firm in his stance, almost like he was behind a screen of some kind, just stood there. Emotionally, he didn't really give too much away, but he seemed to be enjoying the experience. He didn't get what he wanted in his IET, so his education training after Kapuka, which is where they go into their different roles. He wanted to be a diesel mechanic and was kind of promised that he would be a diesel mechanic and didn't end up being a diesel mechanic. He ended up in transport, operating some of the MOGs, the big machines that cart people and things around. So that was very disappointing for him. And he was fine. He was at Punyal, which is where he did his IETs. There was a couple of little flags that were raised down there. He was having problems with another senior officer, and there was a couple of complaints made. That one, I believe, was resolved, and then he was moved to Darwin, and it was Darwin where the real problems started for Daniel.
Isolation.
Yeah, so the isolation, being completely removed from me, because I was still here in Brisbane, his daughter, his networks, his family, his friends, and being put out into something that he didn't want to be in, and also in a job that he didn't want to be in. And if you imagine Darwin in the summer, it is ridiculously hot, and some of the dongas that were, you know, the living quarters were not really equipped to deal with such heat. And we know, if we're thinking, you know, statistically, we know from the research that suicide, heat does impact suicide.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So Darwin is the highest suicide rate in Australia. And if you read the research, you know, heat is probably a contributing factor to that. And if you think yourself, when you're really hot, you know, you can get angry, or if you're not having enough to drink, dehydration can create all sorts of, you know, problems with our behaviour, our coping mechanisms. So it's not surprising. And, you know, when, you know, you have to go and do these really tough training regimes, and for good reason, but when you're out there in 40, 50 degree heat, you may not be getting adequate hydration. You may be sleeping out there, being bitten, you know, by all sorts while you're out there. It's not pleasant, and it does impact people's mood and behaviour.
Just on a quick side note, you said statistically Darwin's the highest suicide rate in the country. Is that reflective in defence as well? Do you know if that's like statistically the same with our defence community at all?
No, I actually believe the areas with the bigger garrisons. So Darwin's quite a small garrison compared to, you know, your Townsville and some of the garrisons in Sydney. South East Queensland is actually the biggest area. Yeah.
And perhaps that's just because of saturation, more people rather than the heat-related stuff.
Yeah, for defence. But Australia-wide, Northern Territory is the highest.
Yeah, okay. And, you said in Darwin, Daniel was struggling with that isolation, the heat, all those number of factors. Was he open with you about those, I guess, those difficulties and those struggles that he was having in Darwin?
He'd tell me what he thought he could share. So a lot of his problems were with his command at the time. And he wouldn't go into too much detail, but he would say there were problems. And when I'd talk about him in, how to try and address it, I'd obviously be coming from a civil lens. Well, you just do this or just do this. And it was very much, well, Mum, you just don't understand. I'm not in that system. It's a very strong and strict hierarchy. You can't just go out and talk to somebody else about it. You have to go through your chain of command. But if your chain of command are the people that are actually causing harm, it puts people in a position where entrapment can happen. And we also know entrapment is a contributing factor to suicide as well.
And sorry, that entrapment, is that just not feeling like there's anywhere or anything or any avenue that you can go down to fix
Correct.
the issues that you're faced with?
Yeah, it's that feeling of there's no way out. There's a feeling of hopelessness, maybe feelings of, being burdensome. There's never a one size fits all when we're talking about suicide and losing people to suicide. It is incredibly complex, and often there's a range of what we call distal and proximal risk factors. So distal, your longer term factors, proximal, those that are happening right now. When they converge at a certain point in a person's time, in a person's life, that's where we start seeing those, ideations potentially arising, and then ideation can then move into what we call action. But what is really misunderstood is people don't need to think about suicide to act and to actually die by suicide. We think that, people must think about suicide or people must be mentally unwell. No, absolute myth busting here and now. People do not need to be unwell, and they do not need to think about suicide to die by suicide. Often it can be just that point in time for that person, and in that particular moment, that might be the only choice they feel for them. So, that's often a big challenge when we're trying to work with people who do experience ideation and have experienced attempts, in that we don't know, unless we are monitoring people 24/7 and mapping the fluctuations for people's, psyche and their mental health. It is impossible for us to know, even with all of the information, all the risk assessments that we do, and all of the tools that we have. It is impossible for us to predict who will die by suicide.
Sounds incredibly complex.
It's very complex.
Like you said, so many different factors and so many different things at play, and obviously everyone's individual experiences as well.
Of course, yeah.
Wow.
So your relationship with Daniel prior to defence, was he a very open communicator with you? Like he could always come to you with problems and
Yeah, I mean, we've always been. Being from, Northern England, it's a very stoic culture. You get on with it, dust yourself off, pick yourself up and get on with it. And he was very much the same.
Yeah.
So, we would speak to each other if there were things going on, and then we'd work out a solution. That's what we did. If there's a problem, we fix it. For him, he didn't feel it was a problem he could fix. And that was a real moral issue for him, because he was used to fixing things as well.
Yeah, right. Very sad.
Yeah, I can't help but think, Nikki, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's probably not a problem that is a fixable that approach of problem solution. It sounds like it's far more complex than that. Like it's hard to come up with a fix for that scenario or that solution.
The majority of suicides are absolutely preventable with the right supports around people. there will always be some that are not preventable. So even though we do work towards zero suicide in this country, it's not possible. It's, it's a flight of fancy. It's a dream. It's just not possible because it is far too complex. If we knew how to solve this, we would have done it years ago.
Yep.
We don't, and unfortunately, people continue to die, and we get left behind to try and figure out what we could have done.
And so, talking about those different supports, do you know if Daniel was seeking, whether that internal or external to defence, was he having some of those supports around him before he passed away?
He was. So he was speaking to a psychologist, and he was also reaching out to Open Arms at that time.
Okay.
And whether it was poor messaging or intentional, he was scheduled to see a psychologist shortly before his death, and he was ordered not to.
Okay.
But this was an issue with regards to communication, because chain of command are not often advised that a person is struggling with their mental health. So they make decisions based on what they know, and if they don't know, they'll do what they're supposed to do, which is command a team.
Yep. Makes it difficult
Yeah.
to make informed decisions when you don't have all the information.
Yeah.
Yep. Wow. So for you said you were talking, he wasn't completely open. Was there any signs or red flags or anything that sort of stood out to you in the lead up before?
Definitely.
passing?
So he completely withdrew from his friends, where he'd come home and he'd be out, partying, catching up with his friends, both civvy friends and army friends. He completely withdrew. He wasn't particularly talkative. There's something in their eyes when it's your child. You can just tell there's something not right. It was almost like he was just zoned and zombied out. Wasn't interested in anything. We'd talk about, him getting support, but he really wanted to leave, but that opportunity was taken away from him. His paperwork would get lost, or he'd be threatened with additional charges for the most ridiculous of things, which I consider to be ridiculous because, I'm a civilian, but things like, your bed wasn't made properly, or there was ash on the floor outside your donga or something, things that everyday people would be thinking, what on earth? But in defence, these things can lead to administrative charges, and commanding officers are also responsible for implementing said charges, and some of those can be weaponised against people. The IGADF are currently in the middle of an inquiry into the weaponisation of the military justice system, which, if anybody's listening and do feel like they've had an experience of weaponisation, please do make a submission, jump on IGADF's site. But, there are disciplinary processes and there's administrative processes that can be weaponised against people, both up against command from, lower ranks, but the opposite as well. Command can weaponise them too. Some people do it intentionally, some people do it because they just don't understand the policy.
And I guess too, coming back to that, people not having all that information as well, that I can imagine that would just compound things no end. If that if you've got a member who or an employee or whatever who is struggling, but your management chain of command is not aware of that, and they're just maybe seeing, I don't know, for want of a better word, poor performance or a change in performance or something.
Yes.
And so if you take the route of discipline and enacting those policies and those judicial systems, like you said, is just going to compound anything that's going on, as opposed to if they have the information, they might act with a bit more, take a different tact.
And that's what was happening in my son's case. So he was failing his BFAs, which is his fitness assessment. He was being charged for silly things, like untidy, unkept uniform or bed or whatever. All of these little things for people who understand mental health would have activated some red flags for people. There were a couple of people in my son's platoon who did reach out to Dan and say, look, I'm noticing this, what's going on for you? And command, they're in charge of lots of people, so it's difficult for them to keep an eye on every person all of the time. But there are definitely flags in Daniel's experience that could have and should have been flagged way earlier. His smoking had increased, his withdrawal had increased. As I said, the BFAs, who was failing, his performance was going down, his moods were changing, all of that stuff. You get to know people when you're working so closely. There were obvious changes going on for him. But the impetus is on the person to reach out for help. Well, sometimes people are not in that space. They're not able to. Yeah. And,
we've had a chat on previous episodes with Sean Phillip, the founder of the Shaka Project, who is in that suicide prevention space. And we spoke about, how we can broach those conversations, because I think often a lot of times people are hesitant to ask the question about, particularly around suicide as well, because people maybe they've got fear of making it worse or fear of not knowing what to say as well. So I think it's important that we sort of, I guess
too, in that defence would be again harder, because, like I said before, there's you have to be stoic and you have to be that person. That would be putting someone in a very compromising position to walk up to someone and say, "Hey, listen, I'm struggling a bit here." For me, it just seemed he didn't have a lot of people in his corner from maybe that upper level. Obviously, his close mates that worked around him were able to see some signs, and I wonder, for Daniel, it felt like a no-win situation. I'm trying to think of every avenue to relieve this, but there's nowhere.
No. And it definitely was that feeling of being trapped, nowhere to go, but also the lack of information. He was really fearful because, I just said to him, well, just leave, just leave, come home, don't worry about it, I'll sort everything out. And he's like, I can't do that, they'll court-martial me. So he was really fearful that he would be sent to prison if he left service. So he felt forced to have to continue and to endure that whilst his transition process was going through, and that obviously never happened. So, yeah. And this is going back, 2014. A lot has happened since, and there's been a lot of improvements since. But there's still issues. We know there are issues. We've just had a Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide. So we know there are still issues that continue to linger, that need much more focus and work.
Yep. And I guess we'll touch on that Royal Commission, because I believe you were involved in that. So you mentioned 2014. That's when Daniel passed?
Yes.
So he joined 2012 and unfortunately passed 2014. How was the process from defence when that happened for yourself?
I had an absolutely lovely major supporting me. He was just absolutely divine. There was nothing that was, too hard or, just too problematic for him. He was there whenever I needed him. There was a lovely lady who was another social worker, actually, who came out to see me. And being a social worker knows what a social worker's going to do and say. So through no fault of her own, I couldn't gel with her at all. It was like, I know what you're going to say. I've got the rule book here as well, so this is probably not a relationship that's going to work. But the major was just brilliant. And the best person of all, which was really surprising to me, was actually there was like a grief counsellor at the funeral directors. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. So
external to defence?
Yeah, external to defence. Just your regular grief counsellor who works in the funeral, parlour, and helps families or helps those left behind, to deal with the funeral arrangements and all that. And she was just brilliant. And maybe it was because there was no expectation. And she was just happy just to chat. And, we didn't even talk about Daniel sometimes. It was just being human. And the thing with suicide prevention is we don't have to know what to do. Just sitting in that space with somebody, not even saying anything,
Just be present.
is sometimes all that a person needs. So there's this misperception that we have to be, you know, these wonderful social workers or psychologists or mental health professionals to sit with somebody when they're experiencing crisis. We don't at all. We just have to be human and say, look, you know, I know this is really hard for you. I just want to sit and do whatever I can with you, and I'll walk with you on this. What can I do? You know, what do you need me to do? Not, well, we're going to do this, and I'm going to, you know, march you off to the nearest, you know, mental health hospital. People sometimes just need people to hold space for them when they don't have capacity to do that.
I wonder if in the context of like first responders and defence, maybe that's a little bit tricky because we're inherently trying to find a solution and be those fixers to whatever we're responding to, or say if we're, you know, deployed, we're trying to bring a solution to everything that we do in this context. So maybe, you know, that could be a potential reason why it's a little bit tricky for some of us to be able to sit and just hold space for someone and not bring forward a solution and not fix the problem, because that's in our training we need a resolution to something perhaps. Or it's just a thought.
And I think too, for someone, I was involved in the peer support sort of avenue, and a lot of people do struggle with those conversations of, what do I say? Am I going to make the situation worse if I say something? I don't know what to say. So they opt to say nothing. And it's whereas you get some people who are just like this lady at the funeral parlour who that's just be me, or be that human that, and I, like you alluded to before, that you didn't need someone that was qualified to your level as well. You knew what they were going to say, and you just needed that person to sit and hold space and be present. And,
Absolutely.
And that's a tricky, I find that a fine balance. People are scared of that because I don't want to make it worse, so I won't say nothing.
And that's where we need to myth bust as well. Talking about suicide doesn't make it worse. We know that. You know, asking about suicide doesn't make it worse. What makes it worse is not having the conversation. Let's bring it out. Let's figure out what's going on, and let's see if there's ways that we can support you. And this is the true core value of lived experience and peer support, and having people who walk that walk and are, you know, talking the talk, who've been through that journey and are still here to say, look, you know, this might not work for you, but these are some of the things that help for me. Give it a try if you want, or, you know, let's work together to see if there's something that will be helpful for you, because we are all individual, and what might work for you may not work for me, and vice versa. So it really is, you know, having those conversations in a place where they're at. So meeting that person where they're at. There's no point having these big, you know, massive conversations if a person is just not able, for whatever reason, to sit and listen or to sit and converse with you. You know, it's pretty pointless, unless they want you just to be like blah 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 and just chew the fat away and not have a conversation with you, which is perfectly fine as well. Some people are quite happy with that, and often people don't want you to go into fix it mode. They don't want a solution. They just need you to hear what's happening and the pain that they're feeling. They just want somebody else to hold that pain with them just for a little while.
Yeah, like I said, it's a fine art, I think, but one we need to learn, definitely.
So, Nikki said that, you know, you had that lovely major and that lovely grief counsellor as well. Obviously, very difficult journey to go through with what happened with Daniel. Did this with Daniel? Was this the catalyst for you to look into moral injury and suicide? Is it suicidology? Was that the driving force for you to start studying those areas?
So when Daniel died, I also experienced significant mental health decline, suicide ideation, and I also made a couple of suicide attempts as well. I didn't want to be here. My son was gone. I wanted to join him no matter what. The highest risk for suicide is a suicide bereaved mother. Suicide bereaved parents are, but a suicide bereaved mother is the highest possible risk for suicide. And I was right up there. I was there, you know, there was nothing keeping me here whatsoever. And it was kind of one of those moments where it was after my second attempt. I'd kind of come around and realised that life had to look very different for me. And it literally was as black and white as I'm either going to live or I'm going to die. Which one is it? Because I'm not screwing around anymore. This is ridiculous. And these are the conversations I was having with myself at the time. And I decided if I wanted to live, my life had to look very, very different to where it was now, because I couldn't keep continuing on this hell that I was living. So I decided that for me to continue on with life, I actually needed to understand this thing that we call suicide. We think we understand it, but it's when you really get into it, then you really, really understand it. So I needed to concentrate all of my efforts on looking what suicide was, what it meant, you know, unpacking every little stone and corner. And that's how I ended up doing or starting my master's. That gave me a focus into something else that I thought could be helpful for others. If I can understand it, surely with my background, I can help people to understand as well, and maybe help them not feel as crap as what I was feeling at that time. In amongst all of that, I also wanted to be as prepared to go head to head with defence as I possibly could. So I needed to be as armed up with qualifications as I possibly could. So back then it was like, well, I can do a master's, but what's the highest possible qualification I can achieve? And that's a PhD. So I thought, I'm in. So I decided to do a master's and a PhD at the same time. I had now found my mission. So I was determined to understand why my son originally died by suicide, going from this fit, healthy, young bloke. Why would it happen to somebody like him? I couldn't get my head around it. You know, we'd been through life together. We'd made a pact. It was me and him against the world, which was a massive moral injury to me. Why did this happen? So that's when my journey began. And it was when I was at the Senate inquiry back in 2016 into defence and veteran suicide back then, that Andrew Koo, who is a wonderful psychiatrist in Brisbane, happened to mention the term moral injury in his submission. And I thought,
what's this?
What is this thing that we call moral injury? And the more I looked into it and the more I read the research, for me it was a massive light bulb moment that went off. I thought, that is it. That is what was happening for Daniel. That is what's happened to me as a mother, his protector, his guider. You know, I've just lost my son. I'm supposed to protect him. What on earth does this mean for me morally? I'm a social worker. Surely I'm supposed to recognise all of these, symptoms. And yet here I am. My son has died. So that was a huge moral injury for me at the time. So I decided to look more into moral injury. The more I learned, the more I wanted to learn. So that's when my PhD really became focused on looking at the relationship between moral injury and suicide, with a particular focus on our veteran military populations. That became my lifesaver. My PhD actually saved my life on multiple occasions. It was the only thing that got me out of bed in the morning. So if people can find that thing, that's what will help get people through those, dark times. And, the book that I wrote from the veterans' experiences that I interviewed as part of my PhD really is about, It's always darkest before dawn. That was the title of my book, and it really is. You go into a dark place, but there is a dawn, and it's finding that thing that becomes your
that
dawn.
driver.
Yeah.
So we talk about moral injury. You know, we've probably all been exposed to different organisations, and I mean, I go back when I worked in a spare parts shop, and I just remember this certain occasion where the boss was, I mean, it was just a bully, and you know, I still think about that and think, what would I do if I run into him, and what would I say, and you know, but the question I have about moral injury, well, I guess what is moral injury, but surely people can't be treating people that way because that's their personality. I mean, for me, it almost seems like it's a let's choose the least path of resistance, and that might be to shut someone down. And I mean, the thing that I'm having trouble getting my head around right now is that when you said the Major was absolutely brilliant, where was he in the lead up? Is my thing. Why wasn't someone calling out that? You know, obviously, if he was there, potentially he would have, but no one was. I just felt like there was no one in that side of things, not talking about Daniel's family, but no one protecting or defending him. And then that Major is doing all the right things post Daniel's death. And I struggle with that because I think Daniel needed that person then and there in that. And you know, we see it, like I said before, why does it happen in organisation? Or why does it happen? What's the, how do I articulate, why does it happen? I mean...
Yeah, I mean, in Daniel's case, there were a couple of people who were there and were in his corner and really did try to help and wanted to help. You know, obviously we know what the outcome was, but there were definitely people there who saw his demise and were really worried about him and were really trying to support him and help him. And again, when people die by suicide, unless we are with them 24/7, it's very difficult because of the fluctuation in what's going on for that person. So Daniel could have seen these people literally, you know, a couple of hours before he died, but there was something that activated his response when nobody was around, and that's nobody's fault. You know, we can't be supervising everybody 24 hours of the day, which is why I said there'll be some that are not preventable. The majority will be preventable with the right supports, but there will be some that we just can't for a variety of different reasons. He would definitely have been one of the preventable ones, which is, you know, the sadness that we have to live with every day. But again, that sadness and that energy that I put into that space is what drives the work that I do now. It's taking that energy and trying to turn it into something, you know, bigger and better for people who, you know, come in behind me. Going back to your question, there are a lot of different factors. We're all individual. We all have our own different personalities, and there are definitely some personalities who do not care about other people's feelings. You know, narcissism is the first one that comes to mind, but there's also other personalities that do create complex relationships between people and amongst people. That's not to say that, you know, people have to have a diagnosis to be an a-hole, because we know there are plenty of a-holes out there just because they're a-holes. You know, that's the human condition as well. And it could be anything to do with our culture, our upbringing, our, you know, our desire for whatever it is and getting whatever it is and walking over whoever it is to get whatever it is. We are very complex beings. Some people will be more motivated by power and desire than others. They may well do what they need to do to get what it is, what they crave. Sometimes that will be good, sometimes that won't be so good. So ideally what we need to do is try and resonate with the good people, and that can be really tricky.
Definitely.
Can we just take a half a step back, Nikki, and can we clarify what moral injury is? Like, is there a definition? I guess.
So there are actually several definitions. I also have one which is in my paper that I'm happy to share as well. But basically, moral injury is what happens to us when our core moral framework, who we believe we are, everything we believe is right or wrong or is good or is true, is violated or betrayed. Now that can be something that, you know, we've done ourselves, or we haven't done. We've witnessed something happening and we haven't done anything about it. Or that can be from somebody else. They've done something to us or not done something that has created a harm in somebody that goes against our moral framework. And it doesn't have to be person-to-person interaction. It can be animals as well. So moral injury in firefighters, from the research that I undertook, the bushfires were an example of moral injury. Fireys having to witness koalas in significant pain and dying. For an animal lover, that's a significant moral injury. I'm a massive dog lover, as you've seen. You've met my dogs today. If anything happened to them at my own hand or somebody else's own hand, and I couldn't help that or stop that, that would be significantly morally injurious. And that's actually happened in some of the research as well. In one of the conflicts, going back a few years now, Jonathan Shea, who's a chief psychiatrist in this area when it comes to the research and the evidence, is also, you know, he works predominantly with veterans in the US. One of his clients who presented to him, it wasn't about the order from, you know, about killing people. It was the order from command to kill all of the dogs in Iraq because a rabid dog had bitten the chain of command. So the command had ordered the immediate death of all dogs, shoot on sight. He was a massive dog lover. He couldn't cope with the moral distress of having to kill animals, and that was his job, that was his order. He said, you know, he'd been in numerous conflicts, he'd seen death, he'd actually had to kill in conflict before, but it was the killing of dogs that completely tipped him over when it came to the moral injury.
That just makes me think, you know, that definition is not exclusive to our population. It's not exclusive to first responders or veterans. You know, talking about the animals, I straight away think of like a vet. They would like have huge exposure to moral injury.
Absolutely.
You know, if they're inherently an animal lover and they're, you know, same thing, putting animals down and all that sort of stuff, I imagine that would be huge exposure for
100%. So veterinary staff, be it veterinary assistant or vets themselves, and I'm actually in touch with a lovely vet who's doing her PhD on moral injury with animal vets at the moment for that reason. Euthanasia can be a really morally traumatic experience for people. Having just had my own dog euthanized, it's awful. So for a vet to see and sit with a family having to go through that distress and be the person who's doing the euthanasia will be incredibly morally traumatic. There's also our lawyers having to set people free, knowing full well that they're going to commit heinous crimes, but they are their defence lawyer, for instance. Our teachers, our social workers, having to make decisions because the organisation or policy or institution they work for is demanding that decision has to be made, even though it goes against, you know, a person's moral framework and may in fact cause harm to the clients that they're treating. We've seen it a lot in social work, particularly in child safety, working with police officers doing removals of children. You know, that shouldn't necessarily be removed, but being forced because that is the policy in having to remove a child from its environment. You know, our Indigenous cultures, our Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander, the challenges over the years with regards to government policy and stolen generation, significant moral injury in those population groups, and what they've had to endure and the exposures they've experienced over the years from poor policies. Massive moral injury. We've already talked about first responders, military veterans, journalists. They can be exposed to horrific stories that can be very distressing morally for people. And, the list goes on. COVID actually did us a favour in that it really expedited the amount of research on moral injury, particularly in our healthcare workforce, who are twice as likely to experience moral injury than, interestingly, first responders. And that is a lot to do with the witnessing of the organisation policy, or, organisation leaders, heads, doctors, whatever, making demands and orders, for want of a better term, that then go on and do harm to their patients. And doctors are the same. They work under the Hippocratic Oath of doing no harm, but yet during COVID, they were forced to make decisions on who lives and who dies, who's left in the corridor to die compared to who gets treatment, and whether they can have PPE equipment, and whether they get to go home and take potential COVID home to their elderly parents. All of this was morally transgressive and really showcased, what moral injury is, what it can do, and how devastating it can impact people.
Is moral injury? I don't want to say relatively new, because these events have obviously been happening since the dawn of time, but the acknowledgement and the, I guess, the attention put on moral injury, is that relatively recent?
Not really. So interestingly, the concept of moral distress and moral trauma was actually mentioned in 12th century BC. So it's been around a long time. Jonathan Shea actually talks a lot about it in his works with the Trojan War. Massive moral injury there, with the fight with Iliad and Achilles and all of those lovely, not so lovely times. It was Jonathan Shea who actually put the spotlight on moral injury in the early 1990s. So that's when the term was actually first coined by Jonathan himself, the veteran psychiatrist, who was seeing lots of veterans, particularly Vietnam veterans, presenting with what was supposed to be PTSD, and he was not convinced it was PTSD. He knew it was something, but it wasn't PTSD. So he was the first one to actually coin the term and start to develop the information and research and resources around that. So he's got the Shea Moral Injury Centre in the US that also does resources and education as well. So the 90s, so what are we in now? 2025, what's that, 30 odd years? Not very good at maths at this time of day. Yeah. And then, of course, research has just exploded pretty much since Brett Litz released his in 2009, and then the rest has just been history.
Is moral injury like cumulative?
It can be. So it can be just one stressor for somebody, or it can be an accumulation of smaller stressors over a period of time. It all depends on a person's own individual moral framework. So again, what could be morally injurious to me may not be to you, and vice versa. So you can have an accumulation of those mini moral stresses that build up over time, or there can be one big gigantic stressor that's it, that's creating significant moral distress for you.
I was talking to a good friend of mine. She would tell me things like, she said, and this was just a series of continuous things that were happening. And she said, I'm finding that I've even changed my own behaviour. When I get home now, I'm acting like the people that are doing it to me, and I've changed my behaviour. So that was creating a stress in itself, because I'm not the person I used to be. So it's a beast.
It is, and it's actually multi-layered as well as moral injury. So we can have that intrapersonal betrayal, which is that our inner betrayal, as you've just mentioned with your the lady you were talking about, that inner betrayal, I'm going against who I am here. There's also the interpersonal betrayal, which is, you know, person to person. But there's organisational, or some people call it institutional, or some people call it systems betrayal. That larger macro level betrayal where a person expected the system to have their back, basically, to be there to support them. And that might be our health system. It might be our defence system, DVA, our fiery organisations, or, you know, whatever the organisation is that a person trusts and is ascribed to and aligned to. If they don't feel that that organisation is looking after them, then that can lead to, you know, moral distress and or moral injury.
So our morals, can they shift as we go through different periods of our lives? And the reason I ask that is because I'm just reflecting on my experience through defence. They've got, and fireys or any organisation have their own values and their own frameworks in which they want their employees to operate with.
For some, so generally speaking and universally speaking, we often have core values that are not movable or changeable. That's it. You know, it may be I am loyal and loyalty is my value and I will not move on that. It may be, you know, integrity or whatever it is, you know, respect, whatever. You will often have a core set of values that will not shift at all. Those core values get stronger over time usually until we become adult and we've had a number of different experiences that might have, you know, tweaked those values, and then they become firmly established and there's no moving them. Other values, they can be a little bit fluid depending on the situation and whether we need to, as you quite rightly mention, align with a certain set of values. And we do that ethically as well. So moral values are often pretty core and fundamental. Ethics are generally written up. So our code of ethics, they're usually derived from moral values. And then our behaviour is determined from the morals and from the ethics. And that's what ascribes our behaviour in an organisation.
Right, okay. So I guess further to that, being that, you know, like you said, with this moral injury is complex, it's multifactorial, all of these things. Is there anything that we can do, both, we'll go individual and at a systemic or organisational level, in the prevention space?
So moral injury affects us biologically, psychologically, socially, and spiritually, and environmentally, because all of those can impact the environment as well. So when we think about intervention and prevention, there are a number of different ways, but because moral injury is multi-layered and multifaceted, we also need to be thinking multi-layered and multifaceted for intervention and prevention. So we don't want to just focus on, you know, the biological impacts of moral injury if they've got spiritual issues and existential factors going on as well. We need to be looking at where that person is at and what their immediate needs are to be able to provide those supports and resources around them. And this is where being a social worker was really handy, because social workers look at the systems around an individual, the person in their environment, so you can see a lot of the big picture. So when we look at moral injury, we think about what is doing the damage, how is it doing the damage, what do we need to help alleviate and mitigate some of that damage. So we can look at all of those things biologically, psychologically, socially, spiritually around that person. Organisationally is a little bit trickier because organisations need to be on board with change as well. And change can be scary for people, it can be big and it can be expensive. So understanding what moral injury is, that education piece, is absolutely critical, because we could be talking about moral injury all night long, but if somebody doesn't understand what it is, they're not really going to be in a place where they can start to, you know, help support change in that place. So organisationally it starts, you know, with changes to the environment. That might be through policy, might be through systems change, might be through using lived experience to come on board and help address some of the factors that are going on. But a big one really is about accountability and transparency in the process. So if something, you know, if you have to go through a disciplinary process, for instance, it is absolutely critical that that process is completely transparent and there's accountability there. People need to be responsible for their own actions, but they have expectations of an organisation as well. And now we have the new legislation and regulations around psychosocial safety and psychosocial risks and hazards. Moral injury is rapidly being identified as a workplace psychosocial hazards. This is not something we can hide from anymore. The legislation actually states that it's not just an organisation that is responsible for people's psychosocial well-being, it's actually an individual as well. So you can be sued if you don't take responsibility for your actions. It's not just about you working in an organisation. So if that's not a wake-up call for people to be able to work towards change and help look at the organisation, identify some of those potential hazards and areas and opportunities for change, I'm not too sure what is. There are already people and organisations being sued because of, you know, psychosocial risk, and people are being psychosocially impacted negatively. It's not going to be long before that happens on our shores with moral injury if we don't start addressing these things.
So, Nikki, just on that, so an example might be when you said that individual will be liable. So if is that, say, I'm witnessing poor behaviour and I don't act on that, am I liable? Is that what we're sort of talking about under that
Could well,
legislation?
there is what's it called? Standby behaviour. What's it called?
It's a
vicarious liability, or
Yeah, it's where you're basically standing by and watching a behaviour and not doing anything about it. There's a specific term for it, and I'm not sure specifically if it's spelled out explicitly in the legislation, but I certainly know in defence there are ramifications and implications for standby behaviour.
Right.
Is it standby? I think it's some.
Sure.
I can see it and I know what it is. I don't think standby is
Bystander?
bystander. Yes, yay, that's the one. Bystander behaviour. There are implications, so I would expect there be something similar in the psychosocial space. So anything that is impacting somebody's mental health and well-being negatively can be basically put in the spotlight.
that would be an interesting piece of legislation to read, I think.
The psychosocial hazard one?
Yeah.
Yeah. Safe Work Australia and Comcare released the updated in April 2023. And they've got some wonderful tools about how to identify hazards, what to do, and it really strongly aligns with moral injury as well. So if you look at the psychosocial hazards, things like poor organisational justice, things like lack of, control, they all align very strongly to what creates a moral injury. So if you have a look at what is identified as a response, a preventative response, they actually work really well in the moral injury space as well. So identifying the hazards, basically, making the area safe as far as possible, identification of supports and resources, and making sure people are able to access those supports and resources without any further harm being done.
So just, sorry, Nikki, for the listeners, you said that, what was the name of that, where they could find that information?
So Safe Work Australia and Comcare.
Comcare.
Yeah. And they're all available freely online.
Excellent.
Just want to touch on something, Nikki. You mentioned the psychiatrist or psychologist in the States who had the Vietnam vets coming through, and he wasn't quite sure whether it was PTSD or not. How does moral injury impact or interact or influence both PTSD and suicide?
So moral injury it can be a standalone syndrome, but it can also quite happily be in bed with PTSD and or other issues that, diagnoses as well. So moral injury can actually increase PTSD symptoms, but PTSD symptoms are not increased. It doesn't work the other way around.
Right.
Moral injury can increase PTSD, but PTSD can't increase moral injury. moral injury, again, is that core violation. It's those feelings of disgust, that feeling of shame, the guilt, the self-condemning, I'm not good enough, I'm an awful person, significant distrust. A person with moral injury often comes with a significant sense of distrust because of that betrayal. So for clinicians, it actually takes a bit longer to build the therapeutic alliance and build the relationship with a person because of this significant distrust that they're bringing with. PTSD, on the other hand, is more about that fear-based response to a life or death situation. Moral injury doesn't have to be life or death. It has to be something that impacts who we believe we are or what we believe to be good and true. PTSD doesn't. So there's some of the key differences. How it relates to suicidality and suicide is that moral injury makes us feel like we are the lowest of the low, the worst possible person. It creates significant feelings of anger, depression, can contribute to anxiety, hopelessness, feeling like a burden, worthlessness. All of these things we know can increase the risk of suicide and suicidality. So that's where the link is.
Yeah, well, I can only think, of in the defence context and first response that those two quite often could be linked. Certainly that PTSD and that moral injury piece, unfortunately.
Definitely. And the challenge for clinicians is because they are so deeply enmeshed with some people, it's how do you tease them apart and to be able to treat each one effectively. That's the stuff we're still trying to figure out. For me, if I could wave a magic wand, I would be simply embedding moral injury treatment processes in with PTSD, regardless of whether we think they have moral injury or not. But there's also a whole suite of validated screening tools and assessment tools now that can distinguish moral injury from PTSD. So once clinicians can learn about those and understand those, use them in day-to-day practice. Use them with all your clients. It's literally a short questionnaire that gives you some information about whether somebody may be experiencing moral injury, and that could be the difference between a successful treatment and an unsuccessful treatment.
Because I think it might have been before we went on air, Nikki, you were talking about that if you're treating a PTSD case, you're not doing the same with a moral injury case.
Correct.
So something you were saying about exposure to the PTSD, you might expose them, or you definitely can't do that with.
Yeah, so what the research tells us is, the gold standard treatment approach for PTSD is exposure types of therapies. For a lot of people with moral injury, the worst thing you can possibly do is re-expose them to that moral injury. What is actually needed, and very different to PTSD, is much more of those forgiveness-based therapies, and also some of those much more body-based therapies. So the alternate approaches that focus on acceptance, forgiveness, those sorts of processes can really help people with moral injury and, with PTSD as well, particularly if they're enmeshed. There's a few treatment approaches out there at the moment that use the arts, so things like writing therapies, drum therapies, as I mentioned earlier, music, meditation, mindfulness, all of those alternates. They're proving really beneficial for moral injury because it doesn't always have to be about talking. One of the, pilots that was happening in Canada was the testing of a mask therapy. So basically veterans were painting and drawing masks to describe their moral injury. They were going through a whole process of, group therapy using masks, and that was found to be really profound. People didn't actually have to talk about their experience because we know, males often struggle with the talk part versus females. So for those therapies that don't involve talking, it can be really useful. And when we're talking about those really deep, dark, awful secrets that people have been holding and don't want to share for that fear of persecution or ostracization, mask therapies or similar can be super, super beneficial to get the experience out, but without actually talking about it. Yeah, so we're finding those sorts of therapies are really helpful for moral injury.
I think we did an episode recently with an ex-defence who was doing woodwork. So they're, again, working with their hands and not really having to talk through that process. It's just...
Yeah. And that was one of the things in hairdressing as well. People, particularly young males as well, were much more likely to talk to me if there's even my own son. This was often the time we'd have conversations when he was sat in my chair, because you've not got direct eye contact, and they can be just, you know, on the phone or in the magazines, and they're just talking, and a different part of the brain is working, and they just blah, and they just let go without any real thought about, oh, I better not say this, I better not do that. And, you know, the amount of conversations I've had in a hairdresser's chair, that's a completely different podcast, but I can say there's some very interesting people out there.
Unfortunately, I don't sit in a hairdresser's chair long enough to get in the conversation. I'm in and out.
I wonder if that's not like a little strategy. You know, we were talking before about how to have those conversations. Just something to, you know, put in your back pocket and remember that maybe someone will be more comfortable if you're sitting next to them as opposed to across
directly
from them.
Absolutely.
Go.
Or driving. Go for a drive somewhere.
Yep.
Talk while you're driving in the car. Go for a walk on the beach. Talk while you're walking.
Yeah, or I think eating as well. You know, if you, whatever you, like you said, that using your phone or having that somewhat distraction, I guess, that you're not sitting across from each other, staring at each other in the eyes, might just be, yeah,
it's not as clinical. It's just two humans having a walk together and chewing the fat, whatever the fat is for that person.
I just want to, while it's on my mind, if you don't mind, just jump back. You mentioned some stats about, I think you said, like, statistically the highest risk of suicide is the mother post suicide of their son or daughter. Do you know the numbers the other way around? Is there a high statistical chance of say if a parent suicided, are the children more likely to then also?
Yes, they are. It's about 3 times more likely at this stage, because my granddaughter, obviously this is an area that I look into, so she's at a higher risk of suicide herself because she's lost her father to suicide. So suicide is intergenerational, and families that do have suicide in their family are considered at a higher risk than those that don't.
How old's your granddaughter now?
She's 13 on the weekend. Those joyous teenage years.
Yes, I don't miss them. And she's going okay?
There's been moments.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, but she's going okay at the moment, so that's good.
Another thing I was going to say, have you got any advice for someone out there or any of the listeners that is currently experiencing that moral injury or going through that? Is there things that, and I guess too, it's hard to confront that head on. Is there something you can advise them to say, this is how you would do it? Or is there, different conversations that they can have, or how to start the conversation, or just anything that would be good use for them to go, okay, I can take that advice on and move forward with it, rather than just keeping it all in and going home and still believing that they're the problem? And
so empowering yourself, learning, educate yourself about what moral injury is. And if that really resonates, take that information to your treating clinician, be it your GP, your psychologist, your psychiatrist, whoever. Take that information and say, I think this is what this is. Even give them references, because not all psychologists in this country know about moral injury, and therefore, it's a learning curve for them, and they can adapt the treatment processes accordingly.
Is that just a Google search on moral injury? Will that?
That will definitely help. If you want to Google
Nikki,
me,
you said
can
I was going to say,
Google me.
you wrote a book on moral injury.
2.
Was that 2
So
books?
I've written 2 books on moral injury.
Name of the books?
Yep. So the first one is Darkest Before Dawn. That's the veterans' lived experiences of moral injury, and that also provides lots of tips and tricks and support opportunities. And the other one is Coping with Moral Injury for healthcare professionals. However, it's written in a way that anybody can pick it up and read it and just learn a bit more about moral injury in the simplest way possible, and what to do and what can be done to have those conversations.
is that also designed for a person who may think they're the contributor?
Well, I mean, I think it would certainly be useful for people, who may think they have contributed, because part of the treatment, the acknowledgement of moral injury is that acceptance piece. We think about our people who go out to war. They've been tasked to do with something that's part of their job. Yes, they did it. And yes, they may feel absolutely awful because of what they did. That's part of it. It's about that accepting your role in that process and how we come to terms with that and how we digest that and how we make that a part of a fabric of us, what we can happily continue to walk forwards with. So one of my papers, when I was doing my PhD, and it's published as well, you'd be able to Google it, was about walking forwards with moral injury. It really was about that post-traumatic growth period and what veterans were telling me they needed to be able to continue to walk forwards in life. And these were veterans who'd all identified as having moral injury and had all identified as had suicide attempts previously. And it really was about transforming their experience, reclaiming that experience, so accepting what has happened, reclaiming it and reframing it into something that is helpful for others, which was very much part of the defence member, the first responders mission in helping others. So it really is taking the values that are intrinsically theirs in, defence members. It's courage, respect, integrity, excellence and service. Taking those values and using them to create the change that they want to see. And part of that was reclaiming, reframing and repurposing their experience into something. And if you think about it, what I've done is exactly that. I have taken that experience and turned it into knowledge that is now helpful, hopefully, to others.
I'm sure it is, very much.
Yeah, that's exactly what's going through my mind. I was like, is that what, you've done exactly what you were just saying?
Yeah, and it certainly wasn't intentional. It wasn't until I'd finished my PhD and I'd put the model together. I thought, oh, that's what I did. But it seems to work for veterans as well.
Yeah. So that reframing, that accepting what has happened, and accepting that there's no changing what has happened. It's just about looking at it through a different lens. Yeah. And then using that as a, maybe for want of a better word, as a look at the positives and use it as a driver or as a catalyst to support those values that you've already got.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
move. And using those values, courage, for instance. With our defence members, we often hear a lot about members not wanting to come forward because of the potential stigma or, deployment impacts. Flipping that, being courageous is stepping out of your comfort zone and doing something you wouldn't normally do. Treatment is being courageous. Putting your hand up and saying, I'm not doing so good, is courageous.
Very
You'll
much.
be a leader showing others that this is what it means to put your hand up and say, look, I'm not doing good, but this is what we can do to help through that period. Because often these moments are just that. They are moments. Something's going on in that moment for a person. It's not fixed forever, but when people are in that space, it can feel like it's fixed forever. So part of what we do is helping people to understand this is a moment in time. 5 minutes, an hour, tomorrow, next week could look totally different.
I guess the where my mind goes to in that, Nick, is it's a complex environment in that, particularly in defence, but other first response organisations as well, in that putting your hand up is associated with the end of your career as well, which has probably put some of that hesitation in place. But on the flip side of that, like you said, imagine putting your hand up, getting the help you need, and then coming back and then being able to share and lead and guide others through that lived experience. And then, showing that it's not the end of the road. In some cases, of course, it probably is the end of the road, but in a lot of cases, if we put our hand up, catch it early, there's a very high chance we can come back to work and then be that positive role model for being vulnerable and for seeking help.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. And it really is about acknowledging when things are not going so good, but also having the support around you. And again, it comes back to that organisational support as well. The organisation has to be on board with saying, you know what, if you break your leg, you'll go and have a few weeks off in rehab. Cast will go on, a few weeks off in rehab. Nobody bats an eyelid. We need to be doing this with mental health. Have a couple of weeks off, get your cast on, whatever that looks like for you. We'll see you in a few weeks when you've recovered. I don't understand why it's so difficult.
Which we've had numerous conversations over different podcasts about that. A physical injury will work our butt off in the gym to get that right so we can get back to work. A mental injury, we're reluctant to do anything with it.
Yeah.
So.
Well, hopefully important discussions like this help, change that and reframe that so that we are sort of looking at, going down that track and looking at it in the same light as a physical injury, even though we can't see it. I think maybe that's the differentiating factor there, is that we can see the broken leg. We can't really. It's harder to see and make sense of
Not
a
unless you're
mental
walking
injury.
around with an MRI over your head or something. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, great.
Just quickly before we wrap up, Nikki, can we have a quick chat about Moral Injury Australia?
Yeah, of course.
Your baby, what is it?
So Moral Injury Australia, it's currently going through a bit of a rejuvenation. So that should be up and ready in the next few weeks at moralinjuryaustralia.com. It basically provides education and resources for people about what moral injury is, some of that language they can use to help, take towards their treating clinicians. But it also offers training and education, particularly for workforces who really do want to get a much more deeper understanding of what moral injury is and how they can start to mitigate some of that for their workplace and their people.
So what does that training and education look like?
So there's a few different options. So the basic training is usually just a day's training, and I go through what the fundamentals of what moral injury is, also, what it isn't, and some of those other diagnoses that can be mistaken for moral injury, as well as things like vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue and burnout, where burnout is actually considered now a symptom of moral injury. But that's another discussion. And then it goes through some of the, potential factors and opportunities that organisations or people can use to help mitigate that. The more intensive one actually goes into moral injury much more deeper. It uses a framework that I've developed, so it's ideally suited for people who are particularly working with people who may be presenting with moral injury and or workplaces, clinicians and the like. And it also does kind of case scenarios, case synopses in it, identifying what moral injury presents as and some of the areas for treatment and supports, as well as all of the basic stuff as well, what moral injury is, some of the workplace fundamentals.
Awesome. Sounds cool. So that's going to be up and running shortly, you said. And
Yeah,
awesome.
I'm about to head off overseas for the next few weeks. So when I get back, it should be ready.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Well, we'll definitely chuck the link in the show notes to this if anyone's interested. And also, one final question from me: your books. How do we access that? If someone wants to purchase those, have a copy? How do they get them?
Amazon.
Yeah. All right, cool. We'll also probably chuck a link up to that as well, just in case anyone. It's just a bit easier for them to find it. Actually, I lied. I've got one more question on the back of that. If anyone wants to get hold of you, what's the best way to do it?
So I'm on all the socials. So just reach out on the socials.
Cool.
Yeah, you can usually find me. If you do a search, you'll find me.
Fantastic.
I'm pretty open and transparent.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Nikki. And from both of us, so sorry about your loss with Daniel, and appreciate you being able to talk about that as hard as that must be. But I'm sure there'll be a lot of pride from your son knowing that mum's fighting and and left leaving a lovely legacy for that person not to struggle like you had to and like he had to. I think that's speaks volumes of what you're doing, and we really appreciate it. So
Thank you.
so thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please show your support by subscribing, liking and rating the podcast on your listening and social media platforms. We are always looking to improve what we do. If you have feedback, suggestions for further guests, topics, or would like to be a guest yourself, please contact us via Instagram.